When people in town first heard that Thomas Wilkes had bought the abandoned Miller barn for $1, they couldn't stop talking about it. The news spread faster than wildfire through the tight-knit community of Briarwood, where gossip was as good as currency and everyone knew each other's business. The old barn had been sitting at the edge of the forest for decades, its red paint long since peeled into a dull gray, its roof sagging in places where storms had ripped through. It had been considered worthless by nearly everyone, a structure so far gone that it was more liability than property. So when Thomas acquired, plain Thomas, the man who worked at the hardware store and kept mostly to himself, went through with the sale, people laughed. They laughed in the barbershop, at the diner, and on the church steps after Sunday service. $1 too much, they said, shaking their heads. He'll put more into fixing the place than it's worth. Probably collapse the first time he swings a hammer. It wasn't just the impracticality of the purchase that fueled their mockery. The barn had a reputation. Children dared each other to run up to its doors at night, touch the rusted handle, and sprint away screaming. Hunters gave it a wide berth, even though deer often grazed in the clearing around it. Stories floated around the strange noises heard late at night, flickers of light behind boarded-up windows, and once, the smell of smoke when there was no fire. Folks said the barn was bad luck, cursed maybe, though no one could ever agree why. But Thomas didn't care about the whispers or the laughter. When he stood in front of the barn that first day with the deed in his pocket, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The land was quiet, only the distant hum of cicadas breaking the stillness. The barn loomed before him, its broad doors hanging slightly open as though inviting him inside. He noticed the way the weeds and brambles curled around the foundation, choking it, as if nature itself wanted the building buried. A cool wind slid out from the gap in the doors, brushing his face, and he swore it carried a faint metallic scent of iron, maybe blood. If he let his imagination wander, he shook off the thought. Thomas had never been a man of adventure. At 39, his life had been marked more by routine than risk. Every morning he woke at 6, made the same black coffee, and drove his rusted pickup into town to work his shift at the hardware store. Evenings were spent in front of the television with takeout, his only company the tick of the old clock on the wall. He had no wife, no children, and few friends beyond the polite acquaintances that small-town life provided. He had grown used to the rhythm, but deep down, he knew he was restless. Something in him had been waiting for a spark, and when the barn came up for auction, that spark lit. It had been listed as is, no reserve, no guarantees. The county had finally decided the property was a nuisance. He had too many complaints from locals about trespassing kids, too many worries that it might collapse. Thomas hadn't even planned to bid at first. He had gone just to watch, sitting in the back of the courthouse room as the auctioneer rattled through the agenda. Parcel after parcel went to people who already owned half the county. Then the barn came up, and no one raised a hand. The auctioneer cleared his throat, called once, twice. Silence. On impulse, Thomas lifted his hand. He wasn't sure why he did it. Curiosity, boredom, maybe defiance of the laughter he could already imagine. $1, the minimum. The gavel struck. Sold. Now it was his. He pushed the heavy barn doors open and stepped inside. Dust puffed up around his boots, the smell of rotten old hay filling his nostrils. The light from outside cut through the cracks in the siding, striping the darkness with pale beams. Birds fluttered in the rafters, their wings echoing against the wood. He could see where rain had leaked through holes in the roof, leaving dark stains on the floor. But beneath the decay, the bones of the place were strong. The beams, though weathered, still stood tall, their massive timbers sunk deep into the earth. He imagined clearing out the debris, repairing the roof, sanding down the planks until the barn shone again. Maybe he'd turn it into a workshop, or rent it out for weddings like the renovated barns in the next county over. It could even be a home, if he dared. He walked deeper inside, his footsteps crunching over broken glass and rusted nails. A tattered rope hung from one of the rafters, swaying gently though the air was still. He brushed past it and noticed how the floorboards in the far corner seemed uneven, raised slightly as if something beneath had pushed against them. Curiosity prickled at him. He crouched, pressing his palm against the warp boards. They felt cold, unnaturally so, and when he knocked against them, the sound was hollow. A hatch, he realized. For a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what lay beneath. Basements and old barns weren't common, and if there was one here, it hadn't been mentioned in the deed. He thought of the stories he'd heard, the ones that made kids shriek and old men mutter into their beers. Still, his fingers found the iron ring embedded in the wood. He pulled. The hatch groaned, resisting, then gave way with a snap of old nails. A draft of cold, damp air surged upward, carrying with it that same metallic tang he had noticed outside, stronger now, sharp enough to sting the back of his throat. A narrow staircase descended into blackness. The steps were stone, slick with moss, vanishing into the dark. He couldn't see the bottom. His heart thudded in his chest, but he wasn't afraid. Not exactly. It was something else. Anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. He fished his phone from his pocket, switched on the flashlight, and started down. The air grew colder with each step, the smell intensifying until it coated his tongue. The walls closed in, damp stone pressing against his shoulders. The sound of his own breathing echoed back at him, too loud, too close. At last, his feet touched solid ground. The beam of his flashlight cut across the space, revealing a room larger than he expected. The walls were stone, rough and dripping with condensation. Rusted tools lay scattered on the dirt floor, their shapes indistinct but menacing. Hooks, chains, a hammer with a splintered handle. And then he saw them. Chains, dozens of them, bolted into the walls and hanging from the ceiling beams, their ends dangling like limp snakes. Some were thick, meant for holding livestock, but others were thin, delicate, shaped for wrists and ankles. The iron was blackened with rust, but in places it gleamed faintly, as though it had been worn smooth by years of use. He stood frozen, the light trembling in his hand. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. Perhaps the barn had once been used for something practical, as storage, butchery, maybe even prohibition smuggling. But the chains, a broken bar, there were too many, arranged too carefully, too deliberately. Not for animals, not for storage. The laughter of the townsfolk echoed in his memory. They had called him a fool, said the barn was worthless. If they saw this, what would they think then? Would they still laugh, or would they fall silent, eyes wide, realizing that the land they'd all dismissed hid something darker than any of them had guessed? He raised the flashlight higher, sweeping the beam across the room. Scratches marked the stone walls along, shallow grooves, as though something had clawed desperately at the surface. In one corner lay a mound of rotted fabric, so decayed it barely held together. It might have been clothing once. The air seemed heavier now, pressing down on him. He thought he heard something, a faint metallic rattle, as if one of the chains had stirred on its own. He spun, light darting across the room, but nothing moved. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Thomas swallowed hard, forcing his breath to steady. He told himself he should leave, seal the hatch, and never come back. But another part of him, stronger than fear, urged him forward. Whatever this place was, whatever it had been, it belonged to him now. And if there were secrets here, he was determined to uncover them. Above, the barn groaned in the wind, a sound that carried down into the basement like a low moan. Thomas stood among the chains, his shadow stretching across the stone, and realized that his life had changed the moment he pulled open that hatch. The quiet, predictable days were over. Something had been waiting here, buried beneath dust and silence, and now he had found it. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the streetlight outside his window tracing pale lines across the plaster. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the basement beneath the barn of the chain swaying gently as if stirred by breath, the scratch marks gouged into stone, the fragments of rotted fabric that could only have once belonged to someone, not something. Someone. He told himself he should call the county office in the morning, report what he found, let someone official come and deal with it. But another voice rose up inside him, quieter but far more persuasive. If he told anyone, the barn would no longer be his secret. They'd come in, dig around, take it away, maybe tear it down entirely. He would lose the only thing in his life that had felt significant in years. So when dawn broke, Thomas dressed, filled a thermos with coffee, and drove back out to the property. The roads were empty, a faint mist curling over the fields. The barn appeared out of the haze like something half-dreamed, its silhouette stark against the pale sky. He parked the truck and sat for a moment, thermos warm in his hands, before finally stepping out. The air felt different that morning, a thicker, almost humming, as if the land itself knew he was coming back. The barn doors creaked open under his touch, louder than yesterday, like a protest. Inside, the dust motes drifted lazily in the shafts of light, and the hatch in the corner seemed to be waiting. He carried a lantern this time, an old kerosene one he'd picked up at the hardware store years ago but never used. The glow was steady, warmer than the harsh lead beam of his phone, though the shadows it cast seemed to dance and lean in on him as he descended. The basement greeted him with silence, heavy and absolute. The chains were still there, lifeless, but his eyes were drawn to the scratches again. He crouched, running his fingers along the grooves. They were uneven, frantic, carved deep in some places, shallow in others. Not the work of idle hands but of desperation. His stomach turned. In the far corner, where the dirt floor met stone, something caught the lantern light. He moved closer, heart hammering, and saw the edge of metal jutting from the earth. He knelt, brushing away the dirt with his hands, until a rusted padlock emerged. It was attached to a half-buried iron ring, the rest of it vanishing into the ground. He tugged, but it wouldn't move. Whatever it was, it had been fixed there long before he was born. He sat back on his heels, wiping the sweat from his brow. The basement was colder than the morning air above, yet he felt clammy, as if the chill had sunk into his bones. He imagined what might have been tethered there, held in place by chains and iron, scratching the walls in a futile attempt to escape. When he finally climbed the stairs, lantern flickering, he pulled the hatch closed and slid an old plank of wood across it. Not to keep anything in, he told himself, just to feel better. Over the next few days, he found himself drawn back to the barn again and again. He'd go after work, telling himself he'd just take measurements or plan repairs, but inevitably he ended up in the basement, lantern in hand, studying the walls, the chains, the lock embedded in the ground. He couldn't explain why. The place frightened him, but it also fascinated him. It was a puzzle, a story that no one else knew, and he wanted to be the one to uncover it. The townsfolk noticed, of course. They always noticed. At the diner one evening, he caught the tail end of a conversation between two old men at the counter. "Wilkes has been out at that barn every damn day," one muttered, stirring his coffee. "What do you think he's up to?" "Probably talking to the ghosts," the other snorted. "Always knew he was a strange one." They laughed, and Thomas kept his eyes on his plate, pretending he hadn't heard. But their words stung, not because of the mockery but because of how close they struck to the truth. He did feel, sometimes, as if the barn was trying to talk to him. One evening, as he lingered in the basement, the lantern sputtering low, he heard it for the first time. A faint clinking, like a chain shifting ever so slightly. He froze, breath caught in his throat. The sound came again, clearer this time, followed by the softest scrap against stone. "Hello?" he whispered before he could stop himself. The silence that followed was suffocating. He told himself it was the wind, the structure settling, a rat dragging debris. But when he climbed back into the barn and pulled the hatch shut, his hands were trembling so hard he could barely fit the plank into place. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the rattle, saw the chains moving on their own. By morning, exhaustion weighed on him, but so did something else. Curiosity sharpened into obsession. He needed answers. He went to the county archives on his day off, a squat brick building that smelled of dust and yellowing paper. The clerk gave him a raised brow when he asked about the Miller barn, but she led him to the back, where shelves of old property records and newspapers lay stacked in boxes. Hours passed as he sifted through brittle pages, squinting at faded ink. At first, there was nothing unusual, just sales records, crop reports, announcements of barn dances. Then he found a thin folder, dated 1927, marked with the Miller family name. The contents made his skin crawl. The folder held a series of newspaper clippings, each one stranger than the last. One described neighbors complaining of screams carried on the night air from the Miller property. Another mentioned missing drifters, laborers who had passed through town and were never seen again. And then there was the final article, brief and unsettling. Sheriff investigates rumors of unlawful activity at Miller Barn. No evidence found. After that, the record went silent. No follow-up, no explanation, just silence, as if the matter had been deliberately forgotten. Thomas sat back in his chair, the old paper trembling in his hands. Screams, missing people, chains in the basement. When he left the archives, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the streets. He felt the weight of the knowledge pressing down on him, making every step heavy. If the townsfolk laughed before, what would they say now, if they knew what he'd uncovered? Back at the barn, he lit the lantern again and descended. The chains gleamed faintly in the flickering light. The scratches seemed deeper, the air heavier. He whispered aloud what he had learned, as though confessing it to the stone itself. "I know what happened here," he said. His voice cracked in the silence. "I know." As if in response, a chain stirred. Just a little, just enough. He stumbled back, heart hammering, the lantern swinging wildly. Shadows danced across the walls, making the room feel alive. For the first time, he truly considered leaving, walking away from the barn and never looking back. But as he climbed the stairs, the thought of abandoning it gnawed at him. He couldn't leave it to rot, not now, not with the secrets it held. It was his discovery, his burden. The days blurred after that. He went to work, answered customers, nodded through small talk, but his mind was always in the basement. He started bringing tools, testing the strength of the chains, the depth of the lock in the ground. He dug at the dirt around it, though every shovelful seemed to release a deeper chill. The more he uncovered, the more convinced he became that something subterranean had been kept there, and perhaps, in some way, still was. One night, storm clouds gathered, the sky splitting open with thunder. Rain hammered the earth, and lightning flashed through the cracks in the barn siding. Thomas sat in the basement, lantern hissing, staring at the chains. They rattled with every gust of wind, clinking like laughter. He thought he heard whispers, low and urgent, threading through the roar of the storm. "Release us." The words were so faint he couldn't be sure he had heard them at all. But he rose to his feet, staring at the padlock half buried in the ground. His hand trembled as he reached for it. The laughter of the townsfolk echoed in his mind, mocking, dismissive. They had thought him a fool for buying the barn. But if he opened this lock, if he revealed what lay beneath, they would never laugh again. He lifted the hammer, raised it high, and brought it down on the rusted metal. The sound rang out, sharp and final, swallowed by the storm. The chain stirred. The hammer blow echoed through the basement, reverberating in Thomas's chest as if the sound had struck him too. The lock didn't break on the first swing, but the impact shook loose a spray of rust. He lifted the hammer again, sweat dripping into his eyes despite the chill, and struck harder. The second blow cracked the corroded metal. The third shattered it. The lock split in two, clattering onto the dirt. For a moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the storm raging outside, thunder rolling across the sky. Thomas lowered the hammer, his breathing harsh and uneven, the lantern's flame wavering in the draft that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He felt it before he heard a subtle shift, a pressure lifting from the air, as though something had been unbound. The chain swayed, slowly at first, then more violently, clinking together in a discordant chorus. Dust fell from the ceiling. Thomas staggered back, the lantern swinging wildly and casting frantic shadows against the walls. He told himself it was the storm, the vibrations, the wind. But deep down, he knew better. The padlock had not been meant for animals, not for storage. It had been meant to hold something back. A low sound emerged from the darkness, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh, but something in between. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, crawling across the stone like mist. Thomas's skin prickled. He raised the lantern higher, though he dreaded what the light might reveal. The scratches on the wall seemed deeper than before, gouged almost to the stone's heart. The mound of rotted fabric shifted, just slightly, collapsing into itself as if stirred by a breath. Chains waddled above, their ends jerking like marionette strings. He stumbled toward the stairs, nearly tripping over his own boots. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get out, to run until the barn was nothing but a distant silhouette. Yet when he reached the hatch, He froze. The wood plank he had set across it days ago had fallen aside, as though something had already pushed against it from below. He burst into the main barn, rain hammering against the roof, lightning splitting the air through the cracks in the boards. He slammed the hatch shut behind him, dragging the plank back into place, but it felt like an act of denial, not defense. Whatever he had unleashed was no longer confined to the basement. The barn groaned under the weight of the storm, each gust of wind making the walls shudder. Thomas pressed his back against the door, chest heaving. He could hear the faint rattle of chains beneath him, muffled now but insistent, like something pacing in the dark. When he finally staggered outside, the rain soaked him to the bone within seconds. He climbed into his truck and sat gripping the steering wheel, staring at the barn through the windshield. The structure loomed in the flashes of lightning, every angle sharp, every shadow too deep. For the first time, it looked less like a ruin and more like a sentinel, standing watch over something he had foolishly disturbed. He drove home in silence, the wipers struggling against the torrent. Sleep was impossible. Every crack of thunder made him jolt. Every creak of the house made him glance toward the floorboards as if expecting chains to clatter there too. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose bright and clear, as though nothing unusual had happened. But Thomas knew better. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, a presence that clung to him, heavy and unseen. The barn was no longer just a curiosity, no longer just his secret. It was awake, and it was waiting. Thomas didn't go to work the next day. He called in sick, though the lie caught in his throat. He wasn't sick, not in the way they meant. Something inside him was restless, gnawing, and he couldn't imagine standing behind the hardware counter, smiling at numbers, answering questions about nails and lumber when all he could hear in his head was the clatter of chains. Instead, he drove back to the barn. The air was still, the ground damp from the storm, and the structure looked almost ordinary in the daylight, just another ruin on forgotten land. But Thomas knew better now. The barn breathed. It waited. He told himself he was only going to check, to make sure nothing had collapsed or flooded in the basement. Yet as he pulled the doors open and stepped inside, the same weight pressed on his chest, the same smell of rust and damp earth filling his lungs. The hatch was still closed, the plank still across it, but he felt no relief. Something could wait years, decades, without making a sound, and now it had his attention. His hand lingered on the hatch handle. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he walked through the barn, studying the beams, the shadows, the places where light cut through in slivers. He thought about the Miller family, about what the archives had revealed, the rumors, disappearances, screams. Had the townsfolk laughed at them too, before fear replaced ridicule? How many had gone missing, and how many had known? When he finally left the barn, he didn't drive home. He drove to the diner. He sat at the counter with a mug of black coffee, staring at the steam, while the murmur of voices wrapped around him. Conversations stopped when he walked in, as they often did now. "Out at that barn again?" one of the men at the back asked, loud enough for half the room to hear. Thomas didn't answer. "You planning to turn it into a bed and breakfast?" Another joked. Laughter rippled. "Haunted tours, maybe. Might actually turn a profit that way." Thomas's jaw tightened. He looked up, and his eyes swept the room, meeting gaze after gaze. For the first time, no one laughed back. Something in his expression silenced them, though he said nothing. He drained his coffee, dropped bills on the counter, and left. That evening, when the sun bled out across the horizon and shadows grew long, he returned to the barn once more. The hatch seemed to thrum under his feet as he approached, like a heartbeat. He pulled the plank aside, hesitated, then yanked the hatch open. Cold air surged upward, carrying that metallic tang he now recognized as more than rust. It was older, sharper. It was the scent of something that had seeped into the very walls. Lantern in hand, he descended again. The chains waited, silent this time, no rattling, no whisper. They hung limp, but there was something about their stillness that unnerved him more than their movement had. His eyes were drawn to the padlock he had shattered. The iron ring it had secured still jutted from the dirt, but now the ground around it looked disturbed, as though it had shifted during the night. Thomas crouched. His fingertips brushed the soil. It was softer than before, looser, like something had stirred beneath it. He froze. Then he stood and stepped back quickly, bumping into the wall. The lantern flame shuddered, shadows stretching long and thin. He stared at the disturbed ground, breath quick and shallow, and for the first time wondered if what had been chained here had truly been held above ground at all, or if it had been kept below. A scrapping sound broke the silence, stone against stone, faint but deliberate. Thomas lifted the lantern high, sweeping the room. Nothing moved. Yet when he lowered the light again, he saw fresh scratches carved into the wall near the corner. The dust around him unsettled. His pulse thundered. He whispered aloud, voice cracking, "What do you want from me?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, faintly, chains stirred. One clinked, then another, like a response. He fled. He climbed the stairs two at a time, slammed the hatch closed, shoved the plank into place, and staggered out into the night air. The barn loomed behind him, its walls dark against the rising moon. He stood in the clearing, gulping in air, trying to convince himself he was still in control. But he knew he wasn't. Over the next week, the barn invaded every corner of his life. He dreamt of chains, of shadows stretching across stone walls, of whispers curling into his ears. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart racing, the faint echo of rattling still in his head. He stopped going to the diner, stopped taking calls, stopped opening his mail. His world narrowed to two places, his small, empty house and the barn. It was on the 8th day that he realized he wasn't alone anymore. He had left the barn late, stumbling to his truck under the silver wash of moonlight, when he saw movement at the edge of the trees. Just a flicker, a shadow slipping between trunks. He froze, squinting, but the woods were silent. He told himself it was an animal, deer, maybe. Yet when he turned back to the barn, he saw a figure at one of the cracks in the siding, pale and thin, watching him from inside. He dropped his keys. By the time he scrambled to pick them up and looked again, the crack was empty. That night, he couldn't stay in his house. He sat on the porch with a shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the darkness. He thought he saw movement again down the street, near the hedges, behind the neighbor's fence. Always gone when he blinked. By dawn, he was hollow-eyed, trembling from too much coffee and too little sleep. He told himself he'd imagined it. But when he drove back to the barn that morning, he found the hatch open. The plank lay shattered on the floor, splintered down the middle. The heavy door gaped like a wound, and the air that seeped from below was colder than ice, sharp enough to sting his skin. The basement waited, yawning wide, chains rattling softly in the breathless silence. Thomas knew then that the laughter of the townsfolk had ended. Whatever had been bound beneath the barn was loose now, and it had already followed him into the world above. The night Briarwood stopped laughing came quietly. The town was wrapped in stillness, the kind that presses against the skin. When Thomas returned to the barn with three men following him, Carter Hansen, who'd mocked him most loudly at the diner, Sheriff Dale, worn but steady, more curious than convinced, or an old Mr. Whitmer, who remembered the Miller family and had muttered warnings no one ever heeded. They hadn't come out of friendship. They came because Thomas had shown up at the sheriff's office paled, trembling, and insistent. He spoke of chains moving on their own, of whispers in the dark, of a basement no one knew existed. The sheriff had tried to brush it off at first, but the conviction in Thomas's eyes was undeniable. He wasn't drunk, wasn't raving. He was terrified. And terror, genuine terror, had a way of silencing mockery. Now the four of them stood in the clearing, moonlight painting the barn in shades of bone. The doors loomed tall, weather-beaten and scarred, and the men exchanged uneasy glances. Carter laughed nervously, the sound brittle. "Hell, it's just a barn," he muttered. "We'll go in, take a look." And the rest of his words died when the doors grown open on their own. Thomas flinched. Sheriff Dale frowned, lantern held high, and stepped inside first. The others followed, though Carter lingered near the threshold, as if keeping one foot in the open air might save him. The barn's interior stretched wide and dark, the air stale with rot. Dust swirled in the lantern glow, catching in their throats. Thomas walked to the hatch without a word. The plank that had once barred it lay broken in the corner. Sheriff Dale raised a brow, then crouched, testing the handle. Cold air spilled upward like breath. "There's nothing down there," Carter said quickly. His voice shook. "Just a basement." "Rats," Maybe he's been spooking himself. Old Whitmer's gaze never left the black opening. Miller built this place, he said softly. My father told me stories. Said they did things out here, things no decent folk talk about. You all thought it was just ghost tales. Thomas's hands shook as he lit another lantern and passed it to the sheriff. See for yourself, he whispered. Dale descended first, boots echoing against the stone steps. The others followed, though Carter cursed under his breath the whole way. Thomas came last. His stomach clenched so tight he thought he might be sick. The lanterns cast trembling circles of light across the basement. The men fell silent. Chains hung everywhere, iron bolted into walls and ceiling beams, some thick, some thin. Rust. And once found, it would not stay hidden.